Now that we've finished learning about the structures of the different types of polysaccharides, it's time to look at why we actually need polysaccharides in not just the human body, but in other organisms as well, as the functions can vary quite significantly depending on the organism and depending on the type of carbohydrate that we're looking at. We're first going to look at glucose, the most common example of a monosaccharide or singular sugar, because glucose is critically important to the survival of humans and because its function is very representative of most monosaccharides that exist, and that is as a source of short-term energy. When we say short-term energy, this means that as long as glucose is present within the human body, it is going to be the primary energy source that is used, meaning that the body will use glucose first and then go to other molecules that are sources of energy only after our glucose reserves are depleted. In fact, this is so critical to the human body in terms of an energy source, mainly because it is the only energy source that the brain can use. And this is why keeping a large supply of glucose within the body is necessary, especially when performing very mentally strenuous activities. In terms of food that you can eat in order to get a large supply of glucose, we can think of grain products here because grain products are made almost entirely of starch, and we're going to talk about what starch is used for in its native form. But if we look at the chemical structure of starch here, we can see that starch can be broken down into many singular glucose molecules, and this is done immediately when you put starchy food in your mouth, because your saliva actually contains chemicals that will break the bonds between individual glucose molecules in order to give us the individual glucose molecules that are needed to produce energy. However, understanding the complete picture requires us to understand what we do with the carbohydrates that we don't use. So particularly if you have a very starch-heavy diet, your body is obviously not going to use all of the carbohydrates that you ingest. And for that reason, we can take a look at starch and glycogen. So starch does not naturally occur in humans. We can only get starch in us by eating it. But starch naturally exists in plants, where plants use it as short-term energy storage, which simply means any glucose that is not used by a plant in order to produce energy is stored in primarily two different locations. One location is in the central structure of a seed, and this exists for a very simple reason. It is going to be the energy source for the new leaves of a plant seedling before the plant is able to break through the ground and produce its own energy through photosynthesis. It uses the starch stored in a structure called the endosperm of the seed in order to get that first burst of energy to grow and break the surface of the soil. The second primary location where starch is stored in plants is in the roots. And if we think of roots that we can actually eat of plants, you can think of structures like potatoes. Carrots are also the roots, and larger vegetables such as turnips or taro or sweet potato. All of these are examples of root structures that we can eat that are very, very rich in starch, because this is where plants store a lot of the extra glucose that they aren't using. However, as mentioned in the previous video, humans and other animals do not actually have starch. They have a chemical called glycogen, which has a similar structure to starch, only with much more side branches. So glycogen has the same function as starch, but is found in animals rather than plants. And in humans in particular, glycogen is stored in two major locations, the first of which is the liver. And perhaps the reason why the liver exists as a repository of glucose is because the liver is located in a relatively central location in the body, which means that if a certain location in the body requires a large amounts of energy, the liver can break off individual glucose molecules from its glycogen store and transfer it to most of the other major organs in the body. The second location, naturally, are the body's muscles. Now, movement, as we'll talk about, is one of the major consumers of energy in the body, so naturally muscles will want to store a repository of glycogen so that they have an easily accessible supply of short-term energy in case a human needs to run or perform any strenuous physical activity. Now, our final polysaccharide, cellulose, is not used for energy at all, but instead is used for structural stability in plants. Now, if you think of a reason why plants need additional structural stability, whereas animals do not from this polysaccharide, you'll have to think about what makes the structure of plants very different than the structure of animals. Now, particularly with animals like humans, we know that humans have bones, what we call an endoskeleton, a skeleton inside of us, whereas plants do not. Plants don't have any skeleton either on the inside or on the outside like an exoskeleton that insects do. So plants require a very, very strong structure in order to keep themselves erect. Erect is just a fancy word that means upright and being prevented from keeling over or falling over. And cellulose, that being the outside structure found in plant cells, is what actually causes plants to be able to stand erect without keeling over. Because, as we've discussed previously, cellulose is the active component of the cell wall of a plant structure, and this is what ensures plants have a specific rigidity even if their structure does not contain any wood, like grass or bamboo, for example. If we think of other organisms that don't have any type of skeleton, eventually you'll think of fungi such as mushrooms, which, remember, aren't plants because fungi don't perform photosynthesis. And if you think even smaller, you can think of prokaryotic organisms such as bacteria. Neither of these have skeletons, but both of them on the outside layer of their cells have examples of different polysaccharides that have a different structure than cellulose but have the same function. So in fungi, they have a complex polysaccharide that is called chitin, whereas bacteria actually have two examples of complex polysaccharide molecules. The most common or most well-known example in bacteria is a molecule called peptidoglycan. And again, cellulose, peptidoglycan, and chitin all have the same function in terms of providing structural integrity and rigidity for the outside of the cells, because none of these organisms have skeletons. Now, just because humans don't have cellulose, and even though humans physically are not able to break down cellulose using our digestive system, that doesn't mean that cellulose is useless. Far from it. We get a lot of nutritional value out of cellulose as fiber. So for those that don't know what the function of fiber is, fiber serves the function of cleaning the digestive system. So if we zoom in using a microscope, we can see that cellulose fibers form a structure that looks kind of like a net. And remember that we as humans do not have the ability to break this down. So when we swallow cellulose, this net-like structure goes through your esophagus all the way into the stomach, and no matter which enzyme or no matter which digestive chemical we have, we aren't able to break this down, which means that this net-like structure is going to push all of the undigested food and all of the waste that we can't digest all the way through the digestive system, effectively cleaning it and keeping the inside of our digestive system healthy. So this is why, even if we don't gain any nutritional value from cellulose, it is still a very important component of our diet because of this reason. Now that we've finished learning about both the functions and structure of different types of carbohydrates, take a look at the case studies and the practice problems after and see if you can test your knowledge of the different structures and functions of polysaccharides.